Hi Year 11, I'm sorry that I can't be with you for today's lesson, so what we're going to do instead is go through what we would have done in the lesson anyway. I've recorded what we need to go through together, and hopefully whoever is covering your lesson can just pause it at the relevant points so that you have time to make notes and write down answers that you need to. So to start off, if you could write today's title, Evidence of Climate Change Continued. So we did start looking at this before half term, and we're just going to continue looking at this today, plus a couple of other paper one revision sections. So once you've written the title, if you could have a go at the starter questions, just 4 quick questions for you to think about. You don't need to write the questions out, just the answers. This should just be sort of quick fire. So if you could pause the video now while you are going through those questions. So let's go through the answers then. The first question, how long ago did the Quaternary period start? It was 2.6 million years ago. You have to get that one pretty much spot on, not really allowed any leeway either way on that one. Number 2, what are glacial and interglacial periods? So glacial periods are basically ice ages, so historical periods of the climate cooling. And then interglacials are the opposite, so historical periods of the climate warming. And we are currently in an interglacial. We are still moving out of a glacial ice age, which was about 10,000 years ago. Number 3, what's the difference between weather and climate? Weather is the day-to-day atmospheric changes, and climate is average weather over a period of 30 years or more. A helpful way of thinking about it is that the climate is what we expect to get, and the weather is what we actually get. And the definition of climate change is a long-term change in the Earth's climate, especially a change due to an increase in the average atmospheric temperature. And that last point is important because, yes, climate change that we are often talking about is changes in temperature, and that is really significant, but it's not only that. Remember that climate also includes things like precipitation, so you just got to be aware of that. So pause the video now, make any changes or corrections to those answers that you need to, and then go on to the next bit. So for those of you who are in the last lesson of term, you should have this sheet in your book. We did actually start filling it in. We started watching a couple of videos on ice cores. So can you get that out, please? We're going to finish going through this. Now remember, this is all just revision, so this shouldn't be new information to you, but given that it was quite a while ago that you went through this, we're just going to recap all of them together now. So if you don't have this sheet, there should be a couple of spares that Mrs. Barker printed off this morning on my desk. So if you could make sure that you've got one of those in front of you now. So we're just going to briefly recap each one one by one. And I know that we briefly looked at ice cores before we broke up for the half-term break, but there were lots of people who were absent in that lesson. So I just thought we'd recap it quickly now so that everybody is on the same page. So if you take a look at these images here, what you can see in the bottom left photograph and the top right photograph are scientists who are extracting what we call ice cores. And the reason they do this is that when snow falls, it traps air into the ice. And when scientists take a sample of the ice, it reveals the atmospheric gas concentrations at the time the snow fell. So that is how they calculate what the temperature would have been like at that time, and that's why it's relevant to climate change. So for example, if you look at this diagram here of Antarctica, and you can see that this will be a core drilling site, so they can drill down into the ice. In fact, some of the ice on Antarctica is so thick, as you can see, some of it is as thick as 2.2 miles deep. So they have huge numbers of records going back years and years. In fact, the ice can reveal the temperature of each year for the past 400,000 years. So in some cases you can even see, in fact I think you can even see it on this diagram slightly here, you can actually almost see the layers of ice that had fallen, or the snow that had fallen in each year. And remember that this is important. We did this in the last lesson before we broke up because of the relationship between CO2 concentration and global temperatures. Now, we didn't actually look at the relationship between sea level, which you can see here, but as you can see with all three of them, there clearly is a very distinct relationship between those. So if the teacher could firstly just pause the video now, give people a chance to make notes on this if they don't have it. And secondly, if you could watch the video on the link, the YouTube video, it's about 3 minutes, I think, and that will help you to further your understanding about ice cores. And once you've done that, you can move on to the next one. So the next one is shrinking glaciers and melting ice caps. This is perhaps the one that you're most familiar with, or the one that is most visible. So over the past 50 to 100 years, photographic evidence has shown that the world's glaciers have been melting, which has caused them to retreat. So when we talk about retreat, we talk about the glacier kind of it appears as though it's moving backwards, but actually all that's happening is it's reducing in size as it melts. So this can be visible if you look at this sort of image on the right hand side. This would be kind of taken or produced using satellite imagery. So in the 1979 to 81 average, this is what the Arctic ice, so ice at the North Pole, looked like. And then in 2007, you can see how that has massively reduced. Similarly, in this image here, okay, so this image on the left is not actually a photograph, it's a piece of art, and we'll talk a bit more about pieces of art later and how they can tell us about the climate, compared with a photograph taken today. And you can see that the snout of the glacier, which is the name that we use for the front of the glacier, used to be here. And in this image, you almost can't see it. I imagine it's back here, if not further back. So this shows us that there must have been an increase in global temperatures which is causing these glaciers to disappear and increasing the melting of sea ice in the Arctic. So both of these two things are happening. There's just another image for you there. So this is a photograph. Oh, I've covered it up there, sorry. That says August 1941 and August 2004. So the same month. That's obviously really important because the glaciers naturally will advance and retreat in the summer and the winter. So you have to look that's actually a good kind of piece of exam advice. Make sure that you're looking at the same month in the exam if they gave you information on this. But these are both taken in August and you can see the differences there. So again, I'm just going to pause, or if the teacher could pause the video, there's also a YouTube video that you can watch at the top there. The next one we're going to look at is fossils. So the reason why fossils are useful is obviously fossils by their very definition, they're preserved within layers of sediment through time, and they tell us about how the plants and animals might have changed and what their features might have been during a different era, and that informs scientists what the climate was like. So we talked before about the woolly mammoth, and if you think about the fact that it's woolly, what might the climate have had to have been like in that context. This image on the left here was actually an excavation which happened in Norfolk, where they had found the remains of a woolly mammoth. So they were then able to assume, for two reasons, that there was ice in the UK. A, because it must have been colder for these woolly mammoths to have kind of lived in or been able to exist in Norfolk, but secondly that there must have been ice that connected Europe to the UK for those mammoths to be able to reach places such as Norfolk. So again, I will pause, if you could pause the video and make notes on that now. All right, next one, rising sea levels. So the average global sea level has risen between 10 and 20 centimetres in the past 100 years. So that is just using recent measurements to find that information. Now, when temperature rises, this happens because the freshwater ice, which is on the land, melts, and more water flows into the sea from glaciers and ice caps. Now, importantly, this is not ice from icebergs, because icebergs are just ice that is floating within the water, it's not on the land. But this is ice that has been what we would call locked up in glaciers and snow on the land, which then melts and then flows into the sea. So you're literally increasing the volume of water within the oceans. The other thing that happens as temperatures increase is that ocean water expands in volume when it warms, so it obviously takes up more space. And this is what we call thermal expansion. Okay, thermal, of course, meaning related to heat. So there are two factors going on at the same time. One is there's actually an increased amount of water, and the other is that the water that is in the sea already is expanding. And those two factors combine to lead to overall rising sea levels. So simply measuring those the sea levels, even going back, if you look at this graph here, to 1800, you can see this graph only goes up to the year 2000, but you can see how those changes in sea level have occurred. So please pause the video now and make notes. The next piece of evidence we can look at is seasonal changes. And if you ask any of your older relatives or anybody older that you know about how the seasons have changed, they will often tell you that they remember that they used to get much colder winters, or that I used to get colder much earlier or stay colder for much longer. They used to see more snow, for example. So there have been signs within living memory of a seasonal shift. Spring arrives earlier, winters tend to be less severe. I would even say, and I know this is very anecdotal, but I would say I've even noticed that in my lifetime. So even in 30 years, and remember, we said that the definition of climate is changes over a 30-year period. So, you know, we have to take that into account. But I would say I've noticed that change even in my lifetime. Of course, these seasonal changes affect the nesting and migration patterns of wildlife, and that's something else that we can study. We can study when birds migrate, for example, where they migrate to, and that is another factor which we can look at to kind of add towards the body of knowledge about seasonal changes. So just pause now. So the next piece of evidence is tree rings. Now, tree growth rings are added each year the tree is growing. I'm sure you've heard that before. And the thicker the ring, generally, the better the growing season. So that can give us information on the temperature and the moisture from that year. So you can count the number of rings to see how old the tree is. You can also look at evidence of where there was maybe a rainy season. So you can see here in this one, this is quite a thick ring, and that's pointing towards the rainy season, versus this one, which is a dry season, much thinner ring. You can also see here there's kind of scar from a forest fire. So we can match up, and this is the important thing, we can match up the evidence from tree rings towards all these other pieces of evidence and kind of triangulate that information to work out that, you know, whether if there was a particularly thick year of ice in an ice core, what is then happening in the same year for a tree ring, etc. So scientists have used that information to kind of corroborate that data. So just pause here. So the next one is human interpretation, which we alluded to a little bit earlier. Now, this is where we look at real accounts from people or interpretations and use that to identify what life would have been like at the time when those accounts were made. So you can see in these images, for example, that people have drawn, or paintings. Even just looking at things like whether the trees have leaves, what the sky is like, how much snow coverage there is. We talked about the frost fairs before at the half term, and how there used to be frost fairs on the Thames, and of course that doesn't happen anymore because the Thames would never freeze over, it never gets cold enough. We can also look at people's diary entries where they describe what the weather is like, and so it really gives us an indication in more recent times of what has happened or how the climate has changed. So pause here. So the penultimate one we're going to look at is evidence from nature. And we briefly talked about this when we were thinking about seasons and how things like bird migrations can change. Because living things, or what we would call biotic factors, coordinate their activities with the seasons. So, for example, birds nest when the weather's warm and when there is food for their young. Flowers need to be ready when bees are around to pollinate them. Animals hibernation and birds migrate when it's cold. So these patterns will change or be disrupted as the climate changes. So we can look at examples of changes to those migrations or changes to those habits, and that gives us evidence that the climate must be changing if those patterns are also changing. And the final one is, of course, thermometer readings. So we can look at how temperatures have changed simply by using measurements from thermometers that shows a clear warming over the past few decades since this data has been collected anyway. And by using this data, scientists have actually found out that since the year 1900, the average surface air temperature globally has increased by about 1 degree. And we did talk before the break about how that doesn't sound very much, but even half a degree of warming is incredibly significant for ecosystems, for sea level rise, and for a number of other ecological and environmental factors. So this is a pretty obvious, simple one, and it's a relatively recent one, but it is also significant. So pause now. So your worksheet should be completed now, and what you hopefully noticed as we were going through that is that some of these pieces of evidence are much longer term pieces of evidence than others, as in some of them we have been able to kind of collate much more recently than others. So I'd like you to create a key, perhaps using two highlighters, for the evidence that is longer term and the evidence that is more recent. And when we say recent, we're kind of talking in the last 50 to 100 years. So anything a bit longer than that would be classed in your longer term evidence. And if you finish that, there's a challenge which you can do, which is that I want you to rank these 9 pieces of evidence from the most to least reliable forms of evidence. So you've got to think about what we mean by that word reliable. So if you pause now, and then we'll go through that afterwards. So this is roughly what your categories should look like. I've actually said for human interpretations this can be both recent and longer term, but pretty much everything else is relatively recent, with the exception of fossils, ice cores and tree rings. Those really rely on data from much longer ago. Pretty much everything else we have been able to explore within living memory or within recent generations. So at this point, let's just do a quick knowledge check. I'd like you to either put up one finger for option 1 or 2 fingers for option 2, please. So which statement is true about temperature records? Is it 1, they give us a reliable short-term record of temperature change, or 2, they give us an unreliable short-term record of temperature change? Pause the video now, show your answers, please. And hopefully you should have got option 1. Okay, and the next question, which 2 statements are true about tree rings? 1, if tree rings are thin, it shows the climate was cold and dry. 2, if tree rings are thick, it shows the climate was cold and dry. 3, if tree rings are thin, it shows the climate was warm and wet. And 4, if tree rings are thick, it shows the climate was warm and wet. So you have 2 statements that are true here that you're trying to identify. So perhaps you could show your 2 options on two different hands now. And hopefully you had options 1 and 4. So thin tree rings show that there was a cold and dry climate in that year, and thick tree rings show that it was a warm and wet climate in that year. So what I'd like you to do now is take the worksheet that you were given, hopefully at the start of the lesson, or if not, could you please hand those out now? On this worksheet there are a series of climate change questions for you to work through using what we have been over today, with a challenge question at the bottom. And there are also some ecosystems questions just to get you kind of thinking in the frame of mind of some other topics that will be coming up in paper 1. So perhaps if the teacher could pause the video now, you'll probably need about 15 minutes to go through those questions, and we'll go through the answers together once you've completed that. So firstly, we'll go through the answers to the questions for the climate change section. So for the first question, name a piece of evidence to support climate change in recent years. You could have had any of these, and then in fact any of the 9 that we had on the sheet. For question 2, the answer should be something along the lines of fossils can be preserved within layers of sediment through time. So you have to get at that idea of preservation for 1 point. And then secondly, you have to talk about how the plants and the animals that change over different time and different eras inform scientists what the climate was like. So you've got to link it back to that climate point for that second mark. And for number 3, ice cores help to show how temperature has changed over time using the trapped air in the ice. That would be the first mark. And then for the second mark, you've got to again link it to atmospheric conditions and gas concentrations and how that relates to temperature. So give yourself a mark out of 2 for that question, a mark out of 2 for question 2, and tick off if you got a correct piece of evidence for question 1. We'll now go through the answers to the ecosystems questions. So number 1, your example of a small-scale ecosystem should be a freshwater pond. Number 2, what is meant by biotic and abiotic? Biotic simply means living things, and abiotic means non-living. As long as you've got that the right way around, you can have the point there. So a consumer is an animal that gets their energy from the sugars produced by the producers. So you've got to include the concept of energy in there. You don't necessarily have to talk about sugars, but as long as you've got energy in there, you can have that point. And you've got to say that they get that energy from the producers. Now, producers are organisms that produce energy from the environment, mainly sunlight, into sugars. So you've got to talk about the fact that they are the ones who are producing the energy rather than getting their energy from any other organisms. Number 5, give 2 human activities that could impact on ecosystems. There's quite a lot you could say here. You could talk about agricultural fertilizers that link to eutrophication. You could talk about farmers draining their ponds to use for irrigation and how that will kill aquatic plants. You could talk about how hedgerows being removed or deforestation both can destroy habitats, anything along those lines. And then finally, number 6, where do we find tropical rainforests? On or near the equator at low latitudes between the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn. Please don't just say at the equator. That's not true. They're found at a belt surrounding the equator in the entire tropical region between the Tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. We'll go on to number 7 next. Number 7, where are deserts found? So what you must have in there is that they are roughly 30 degrees north and south of the equator at the tropics. You've got to get 30 degrees in there, and you've also got to say it's both north and south. You don't just get a mark for saying just at 30 degrees. Number 8, give 2 features of the tropical rainforest climate. What we're really looking for here is for you to refer both to high temperatures and to heavy rainfall or precipitation, and the fact that they both occur all year round. Number 9, what are the soils like in tropical rainforests? Well, generally they're pretty infertile, which is surprising in some ways because we'd expect that this really biodiverse environment would have quite fertile soils. But as we know, the soils are pretty shallow, they're pretty infertile. A lot of that is because of heavy rainfall leaching the soils, which is where the rain washes away any of the nutrients. And it leaves behind this infertile red iron-rich soil called latosol. Number 10, identify 2 plant adaptations in a tropical rainforest. I mean, there's lots you could have had here. Now, look at the command word. It just said identify. It didn't say explain. So all you had to do was give 2 examples. So if you said, for example, epiphytes and drip tip leaves, that would be fine. And number 11, identify 2 animal adaptations in a tropical rainforest. Again, it's not asking for specific animals and it's not asking for you to explain them. And it will depend on the animal that you were perhaps thinking of, but you could include things like camouflage, mimicry, having a limited diet, poison, etc. So perhaps pause now and make sure you've got all of those down. So finally, the last thing for you to do today is have a think about reviewing some of your tectonic hazards knowledge. There are these questions that I want you to go through now. I want you to write the answers in your book, write the question out first, then write the answers. And we will actually go through the answers together in our lesson on Friday. Can you make sure you're also writing down the number of marks available for each question? Number 3 is not out of any number of marks. That's only applies for question 1 and 2. Also, do have a go at the challenge. Everybody should be able to do that. So if you could pause the video now and answer those questions, please. These final questions are only if you finished. I'd be quite surprised if you have, but if you have, well done. So firstly, I want you to read pages 42 to 45. So what we looked at for most of today's lesson was evidence for climate change. And what you're going to now think about is what the causes of climate change are. So we've thought about the fact that we know it's happening. Now we've got to think about what is actually causing it to happen. So I want you to create a 2-page spread in your book with these headings. So on one page, natural causes of climate change, and on the other page, human causes of climate change. And I want you to use the information to summarize these causes of climate change. And it includes things like the Milankovitch cycles, which I know many of you struggled with or you couldn't quite remember from before. So I will be going through all of this with you in class anyway, but it's good to just do a bit of pre-reading before we go through it together. If you finish that, the challenge is to answer the practice questions on pages 43 and 45. And we will go through a lot of this together on Friday or the following Friday's lesson. And I look forward to seeing you all then. So a reminder that your homework is just continuing to do your revision. You can carry on with all of the different resources that I've given you to revise for paper 1. And if I could just ask the teacher who has covered this lesson to please write on a post-it note where you got up to, just so that I know where to pick up in the lesson on Friday, that would be great. Thanks very much. Have a good week. Bye.